The footage is raw, stripped of cinematic grace. It is the cold, analytical language of a weapon system, and yet what it shows is something that defies language. An object dark against the infrared glare of a winter ocean hovers with an impossible stillness. Then it accelerates, not with the familiar physics of thrust and combustion, but with a movement that seems to rewrite the laws of motion itself. A fleet of United States Navy F/A-18 Super Hornets, the absolute apex of our known aerodynamic technology, struggles merely to keep it in frame. You can hear the pilots, their voices, a mixture of professional calm and profound, unadulterated disbelief. There's a whole fleet of them. These are not excitable civilians. They are career aviators, individuals, trained to identify, to classify, and to engage any known aircraft in the world. Their minds are repositories of every conceivable threat profile, every make and model of jet, drone, and missile. But this fits nowhere. It is a ghost in their multi-million-dollar machines. This encounter off the coast of San Diego in 2004 was not an isolated incident. It was merely the first crack in a dam of official silence, a barrier meticulously constructed over 70 years. The footage, codenamed FLIR 1, would eventually leak, joining a growing collection of officially verified yet utterly inexplicable military encounters. There is the gimbal video from 2015, where a saucer-like object rotates against a ferocious headwind, prompting the now famous exclamation from a seasoned pilot, "Look at that thing, dude, it's rotating." And there is Go Fast, another 2015 incident showing a tiny object skimming the waves at astonishing speed, its performance so far beyond our capabilities that the pilots, the very tip of our nation's spear, can only laugh with a kind of bewildered awe. These are not blurs, not weather balloons or swamp gas. They are solid, observable objects tracked on multiple sensor systems, seen with the naked eye by the world's most reliable observers, and performing maneuvers that have been openly described by the former Director of National Intelligence as displaying technologies that we don't have and, frankly, are not capable of defending against. For generations, this was the modern mythology of the fringe, the stuff of late-night radio shows and grainy photoshopped hoaxes. The men and women who witnessed these things firsthand, like Commander David Fravor or Lieutenant Ryan Graves, were often faced with a terrible choice: speak up and risk career suicide, ridicule, and psychological evaluation, or remain silent, burying a truth that felt seismic. The official policy of the United States government, and indeed of governments around the world, was a masterclass in institutional dismissal. Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force's signature study in the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, concluded with the infamous Condon Report, a document that many insiders now view as a predetermined exercise in public relations. Its conclusion was simple and absolute: there is nothing to see here. The subject was deemed a dead end for science, a distraction for the military, a playground for cranks. The official narrative was hermetically sealed. The sightings were misidentified weather phenomena. The radar returns were equipment malfunctions or atmospheric clutter. The pilot testimonies were the result of vertigo or stress or worse. A cultural stigma was expertly cultivated, a fortress of ridicule built around the topic so high that even the most credible witness would hesitate to scale its walls. Careers were quietly ended. Reports were buried in bureaucratic catacombs. A subject of profound scientific and existential importance was relegated to the cultural attic left to gather dust. And for over half a century that policy held. The silence was deafening, until suddenly it wasn't. The shift did not begin with a presidential address or a dramatic revelation from a secret hangar. It began as a tremor, a quiet but undeniable change in tone. In 2017, the New York Times, the very pillar of the media establishment, published a story that should have changed the world overnight. It detailed a secret Pentagon program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP, and with it they released the videos: Gimbal, Go Fast, FLIR 1. For the first time, the public was seeing what our most advanced military sensors were seeing, hearing what our best pilots were hearing. The official seal of the Pentagon was implicitly on the footage. The era of reflexive denial was over. This was not a leak, it was a curated release, a deliberate crack in the monolith of secrecy, and through that crack a flood of new questions poured forth. Why now? Why, after 70 years of categorical, often contemptuous denial, would the most powerful government on Earth suddenly reverse course? Why would it risk global ontological shock, admitting to its citizens and its adversaries that its airspace, the most heavily monitored in human history, is being routinely penetrated by objects of unknown origin, intent, and capability? The official explanation is flight safety for our aviators and national security. A valid concern, certainly. The idea of advanced drones from a terrestrial adversary operating with impunity in restricted military training areas is a terrifying prospect. Yet the performance characteristics on display in these encounters so far exceed the known physics of our leading aerospace programs or those of our rivals that they stretch the terrestrial explanation to its breaking point. These objects exhibit what the Pentagon itself now calls the 5 observables: anti-gravity lift, sudden and instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocities without signatures like heat plumes or sonic booms, low observability or cloaking and transmedium travel, the ability to move seamlessly between air, sea, and even space. No single one of these is achievable with our current technology. The verified UAP incidents display all 5 at once. This is not an incremental leap. It is a quantum jump in technology, a difference not like a propeller plane and a jet, but like a canoe and a starship. In the years since that first New York Times article, the pace of disclosure has only quickened, becoming a controlled, almost rhythmic demolition of the old taboo. The United States Congress, once the source of mockery on the subject, is now holding sober, classified briefings. They have passed legislation baked into the National Defense Authorization Act, mandating the collection and analysis of these strange reports from across the military and intelligence community. A new office has been formed, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, tasked with bringing scientific rigor to a topic once treated as a joke. We have seen public hearings where high-ranking intelligence officials like Ronald Moultrie and Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick speak in careful, sanitized language about unidentified anomalous phenomena. The acronym itself, UAP, is a masterstroke of bureaucratic rebranding, stripping away the cultural baggage of UFO and flying saucer and recasting the mystery in the sterile, serious language of national security analysis. The message, whether stated explicitly or not, is clear. This is real, it is serious, and we do not know what it is. But the central question echoes louder than ever. Why now? The national security explanation feels incomplete, a partial truth designed to mask a deeper, more unsettling one. Governments, especially military and intelligence agencies, do not willingly relinquish secrets. They do not declassify information that reveals their own vulnerabilities unless compelled by a force even greater. They do not pivot on a 70-year policy of secrecy and ridicule without a profound driving motivation. Is it possible that the public UAP narrative, this steady drip of declassified videos and congressional hearings, is not the story itself, but the prelude to the story? Is it an acclimatization program, a managed, globally coordinated effort to prepare the human psyche for a revelation so profound it could alter our understanding of reality itself? If so, what could be the catalyst for such a drastic, unprecedented strategy? What could be so imminent, so undeniable, that it forced the keepers of the biggest secret in human history to finally begin showing their hand? The answer, we believe, may not have come from our own skies. It may have come from much, much farther away. It arrived as a whisper in the dark, a phantom on a photographic plate. A discovery made not by a fighter pilot, but by an automated telescope scouring the heavens for killer asteroids. Its official designation is 3I, Atlas. The I stands for Interstellar, the third such object ever confirmed to have entered our solar system from the vast, cold emptiness between the stars. The first was Oumuamua, a bizarre cigar-shaped enigma that tumbled past us in 2017, accelerating away from the sun in a way our scientists still cannot fully explain. The second was Borisov, a more conventional, albeit alien comet. But 3I Atlas was different. It was not a tumbling rock or a dirty snowball. From the moment it was detected on the fringes of our system, it behaved with a sense of purpose that baffled astronomers. Its trajectory was not the graceful, predictable arc of a body obeying the elegant choreography of gravity. It was corrected. Subtle, almost imperceptible course adjustments were detected tiny burns that defied any known natural phenomenon, like outgassing. It navigated the gravitational labyrinth of our outer planets with an unnerving precision, as if it possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain. As it drew closer, its strangeness only deepened. Spectroscopic analysis, our way of tasting light to learn an object's composition, yielded results that were paradoxical, almost contradictory. It seemed to be composed of materials with extreme tensile strength, far beyond that of any natural meteoritic iron, and it reflected light in a way that suggested a smooth, almost polished artificial surface. It emitted no discernible heat signature, a thermal ghost that should have been impossible for an object of its size basking in the unfiltered light of the sun. It was a contradiction wrapped in an anomaly, a silent, cold object that moved with intent. This was not a UAP buzzing a carrier group. This was a visitor from another star system, and it was behaving less like a piece of cosmic debris and more like a probe. And here is the crucial, unsettling timeline. The initial, highly classified detection and analysis of 3I, Atlas, and its bizarre non-ballistic trajectory began in the very same period that the Pentagon started orchestrating the public release of its UAP files. As this interstellar object drew closer to Earth, the pace of official UAP disclosure in Washington accelerated, as astronomers and astrophysicists began to grapple with the impossible physics of 3I, Atlas. In private, the government began preparing the public for the concept of technologies that operate beyond our known physics. Is this a coincidence, or are the two events inextricably linked? Is the phenomenon in our skies and the visitor from deep space part of the same singular story? We are proposing a thesis that is as extraordinary as it is logical, that the sudden historic shift in the US government's policy on UAP is not a reaction to a terrestrial threat or a newfound concern for pilot safety. It is a direct response to the arrival of 3I Atlas, a response to the chilling realization that something was coming, something intelligent, ancient, and technologically transcendent, and that the strange objects that have been operating in our atmosphere with impunity for decades might have been the precursors, the advanced scouts. And the Pentagon, faced with an imminent and undeniable event, had no choice but to begin the slow, painful process of telling us the truth. This is the story of that pivot. A journey into the heart of a 70-year cover-up and the cosmic catalyst that finally brought it to an end. We will speak to the pilots who saw the impossible, the intelligence officers who guarded the secret, and the scientists now racing against time to understand what 3I Atlas truly is. Because the updated report from the Pentagon is more than just a document, it is a signal, a recognition that our place in the universe is about to be fundamentally redefined. The age of ambiguity is over, something has changed, and we must find out why. What happens to a memory when a nation is told to forget it? Not a memory of war or of triumph or of tragedy, but a memory of something far stranger. A memory of an impossible question that once hung heavy and luminous in the skies of a confident post-war world. It's a story we think we know, a tale relegated to dusty archives and late-night talk shows, a cultural footnote wrapped in tinfoil. But the truth is far more complex, a history not of delusion but of deliberate dismissal, a long Cold War waged not against an earthly enemy, but against an inconvenient and persistent mystery. To understand why the Pentagon is speaking now, you must first understand the decades of engineered silence. You must return to a time when the question wasn't a joke, it was a matter of national security. Our story begins in the thin, dry air of 1947. America, victorious and unrivaled, was striding into a new atomic age, a future it believed it could control, forged in the crucible of its own genius. The sky was not a place of wonder but a new frontier to be conquered, a strategic high ground. Then, on a summer day in New Mexico, something fell. The initial report from the Roswell Army Airfield was stunningly direct, a thunderclap of a headline that echoed around the globe. They had recovered a flying disc. For a brief, electrifying moment, the world held its breath. The impossible had seemingly arrived, but just as quickly as the story broke, it was smothered. The official narrative was rewritten overnight. The cosmic bombshell degraded into the mundane wreckage of a weather balloon. It was the first and perhaps most important act in a long drama of official denial, a pattern of swift retraction and public pacification that would define the subject for generations. The Roswell incident became the creation myth of a modern folklore, but its real significance wasn't what fell from the sky. It was the birth of a dual narrative. There was the story told to the public, simple and dismissive, and then there was the whisper of another story, one that unfolded behind the closed doors of military intelligence. The skies themselves seemed to conspire against this new silence. Just weeks before Roswell, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold, scanning the majestic peaks of the Cascade Mountains, witnessed 9 crescent-shaped objects, moving at impossible speeds, skipping across the atmosphere. He said, "Saucer would if you skipped it across water." His description, flying saucers, gave the phenomenon a name, a label that captured the public imagination and transformed isolated sightings into a national obsession. Suddenly, they were everywhere. Reports flooded in from every corner of the country, from police officers, from commercial airline pilots, from ordinary citizens who swore they had seen something that defied all known laws of aerodynamics. This was not yet a fringe belief. It was a legitimate, perplexing crisis. Because in the nascent chill of the Cold War, every unidentified object in American airspace carried with it a terrifying question. Is it theirs? The specter of advanced Soviet technology, of a secret weapon that could render America's atomic arsenal obsolete, haunted the halls of the pair. Pentagon. The fear wasn't of little green men, but of the very real Red Menace. And so the United States Air Force was forced to act. They couldn't ignore the deluge of reports, especially those from their own trained observers. Thus began the official era of investigation, a series of projects whose names now sound like artifacts from a forgotten time. Project Sign, Project Grudge, and the most famous of all, Project Blue Book. Publicly, their mission was to scientifically analyze the data to determine if these objects posed a threat to national security. But behind the scenes, a different unstated objective was taking shape: to manage public perception, to quell the rising tide of what the government was beginning to see as mass hysteria. To spearhead this effort, they sought out a scientific mind, someone with impeccable credentials who could bring a sober, skeptical eye to the mounting chaos. They found him in Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a brilliant astronomer from Ohio State University. Hynek was the perfect choice, a man of empirical rigor who was convinced the entire affair was a colossal misunderstanding, a product of misidentification and overwrought imaginations. His job was to be the great debunker, the voice of scientific reason that could explain away the inexplicable. He would travel the country investigating the most compelling cases, armed with charts of celestial bodies, weather data, and a deep-seated belief that every mystery had a conventional solution. He would explain how the planet Venus, shimmering through atmospheric distortion, could be mistaken for a hovering craft. He would demonstrate how temperature inversions could create radar ghosts that fooled even the most experienced operators. For every saucer, he had a swamp gas. For every anomaly, an answer. But as the years wore on and the case files piled higher and higher, Hynek's comfortable certainty began to erode. He was encountering witnesses who were not easily dismissed, men and women whose credibility was beyond reproach, pilots, engineers, and military commanders who were describing things that simply did not fit into his neat, orderly categories. They spoke of silent, massive craft that could accelerate, instantaneously execute right-angle turns that would crush any human pilot and disappear in the blink of an eye. These weren't just lights in the sky. They were structured objects under intelligent control, displaying a technology that seemed to mock our own. Project Blue Book, under Hynek's reluctant watch, became a repository of the truly bizarre, a vast library of the impossible. Over its 22-year lifespan, it would investigate more than 12,600 cases. The Air Force would publicly state that the vast majority of these were easily explained, but a persistent, irreducible number remained. 701 of them were officially classified as unidentified. These were the hard cases, the ones that defied every conventional explanation. They were the sightings backed by multiple witnesses, corroborated by radar, and sometimes even accompanied by physical evidence. One such event exploded over the nation's capital in the summer of 1952. For 2 consecutive weekends, a flotilla of unexplained lights appeared over Washington, D.C., zipping over the White House, the Capitol building, and the Pentagon itself. Air traffic controllers at National Airport tracked them on radar, their movements so sharp and erratic they defied belief. The Air Force scrambled fighter jets to intercept, only to have the objects either toy with them circling the interceptors or vanish the moment the jets got close. The panic was palpable. President Truman himself demanded answers. The incident became a front-page sensation, forcing the Air Force to hold the largest press conference since World War II. The official explanation, a temperature inversion, a trick of the weather, creating phantom radar returns. But the pilots who were there, the men who saw these things with their own eyes, knew differently. They knew that what they had chased through the midnight sky was no weather phenomenon. It was in these moments of profound contradiction that the true nature of the official investigation revealed itself. It was not a genuine scientific inquiry so much as a public relations campaign, a theatre of skepticism designed to manage a problem that refused to go away. For every expert who, like Hynek, found themselves drawn deeper into the mystery, there were others in the intelligence community who believed the entire subject was a dangerous distraction, or worse, a potential tool for psychological warfare that could be exploited by America's enemies. The debate raged in classified circles, but by the mid-1960s, the Air Force had grown weary of its role as the nation's UFO custodian. The Cold War had evolved. The threat was now ICBMs and spy satellites, not mysterious disks. The phenomenon had become a political headache, an expensive and embarrassing distraction. They needed a way out, an official final-sounding judgment that would allow them to close the book on the subject forever. That judgment would come in the form of the Condon Committee. Commissioned by the Air Force in 1966 and based at the University of Colorado, it was billed as the definitive independent scientific study that would settle the UFO question once and for all. Headed by the respected physicist Dr. Edward Condon, the project was from the outset mired in controversy. Internal memos later leaked revealed that the conclusion was all but written before the investigation had even begun. Condon himself was openly contemptuous of the subject, publicly mocking the very idea he was being paid to study. The final report, released in 1969, was a masterpiece of dismissal. While its nearly 1,000-page body contained dozens of compelling cases that the committee's own investigators admitted they could not explain its summary, the only part most officials and journalists would ever read was unequivocal. It declared that the study of UFOs had yielded nothing of scientific value and that no further investigation was warranted. It was the nail in the coffin. Armed with the Condon Report's conclusion, the Air Force had the justification it needed. On December 17th, 1969, Project Blue Book was officially terminated. The message to the American public was clear. There is nothing to see here. The mystery is solved. It was all a mistake. Go home. And with that, the Great Silence began. The closure of Blue Book was more than just the end of a government program. It was a powerful cultural signal. It gave official sanction to ridicule. The subject was now not only unscientific, it was laughable. The serious national security question of the 1,950 seconds devolved into the tabloid fodder of the 1,970 seconds and beyond. Witnesses, once treated as valuable sources of intelligence, were now branded as crackpots and kooks. The term UFO became synonymous with conspiracy theories and alien abductions pushed so far to the fringe that no serious academic, no credible politician, and certainly no career-minded military officer would dare to touch it. A giggle factor descended like a lead blanket, smothering legitimate inquiry and enforcing a powerful unspoken taboo. If you saw something, you said nothing. Not if you valued your reputation, your career, your credibility. This was the genius of the strategy. You don't need to censor a topic if you can make it a joke. You don't need to classify documents if you can ensure that no one of consequence will ever ask to see them. The mystery was driven underground, but it did not disappear. While the public conversation faded into caricature, a different one continued in the most secure places on Earth. It continued in the cockpits of the world's most advanced aircraft and in the darkened rooms of naval carrier strike groups. The phenomenon, it seemed, was utterly indifferent to the Condon report. The objects kept appearing. Military aviators, the men and women entrusted with defending the nation's airspace, continued to have encounters. These were not people prone to fantasy. They are a breed apart, selected for their stability, their sharp senses, their ability to perform under unimaginable pressure. Their life's work is the precise and sober identification of what does and does not belong in the sky, and they were seeing things that defied their training, their technology, and their understanding of physics. They saw objects with no visible means of propulsion, no wings, no control surfaces, no heat plumes that could outmaneuver their billion-dollar jets as if they were standing still. But now there was no Project Blue Book to call. There was no official channel for reporting such an event without inviting a psychiatric evaluation or a quiet suggestion to take some leave. A new unwritten rule took hold: you see it, you don't report it. You might talk about it with your wingman over a beer far from any listening ears, but you did not put it in a formal report. You did not risk a promising career on a story that your superiors were officially mandated to ignore. So the data stream was rerouted. It flowed not into official archives, but into a deep, hidden reservoir of anecdotal experience, a silent river of encounters that ran beneath the frozen surface of official denial. Occasionally a piece of this data would surface. A radar tape would be quietly preserved. An audio recording between a pilot and a control tower would leak. A photograph would emerge from a foreign military. Figures like the French scientist Jacques Vallée, a former colleague of Hynek's, refused to let the inquiry die. He continued a quiet, methodical investigation, arguing that the phenomenon was not merely extraterrestrial, but something far more complex, a control system that had been interacting with humanity for centuries. Others, deep within the labyrinth of the American intelligence community, were beginning to connect the dots. They were seeing the modern data from advanced sensor systems, from Aegis-class cruisers and nuclear submarines, and realizing that the unidentifieds from the Blue Book era had not vanished. They had simply become more sophisticated, and so had our ability to track them. The quiet accumulation of these new high-fidelity encounters created a profound tension inside the system. On one hand, there was the public posture of utter disinterest, a policy of institutional ridicule hardened over 50 years. On the other, a growing, undeniable body of evidence captured by the most sensitive instruments in the U.S. arsenal that showed something real, tangible, and inexplicable was operating with impunity in military-controlled airspace. The old weather balloon and swamp gas explanations of the past were laughably insufficient to account for what these new systems were recording. The official story, the one crafted so carefully in the wake of the Condon report, was becoming brittle, cracking under the weight of a truth it could no longer contain. A secret can only be kept for so long when the evidence against it is screaming from a pilot's heads-up display. What happens when that silent river of data, fed by decades of suppressed encounters, finally grows so powerful that it breaches the dam of official denial? What is the single event, the one undeniable case that can force a government that has spent half a century saying no to finally hesitantly begin, to whisper maybe? For 70 years, the official story had been a masterclass in misdirection. A carefully constructed labyrinth of prosaic explanations of ridicule and of deafening silence. The rules of the game were simple. Those who saw things kept quiet, and those in power made sure it stayed that way. The phenomenon, whatever it was relegated to the fringes, a ghost in the cultural machine, a story told in whispers, never in the briefing rooms of the powerful. But on December 16, 2017, the game changed forever. The silence was not merely broken, it was shattered by a headline on the front page of the New York Times, a declaration that sent a silent earthquake through the foundations of national security journalism and our collective understanding of reality. The headline was a quiet thunderclap, glowing auras, and black money, the Pentagon's mysterious UFO program, and with it the ghosts came flooding out of the machine. What followed was not another apocryphal tale, not a grainy photo from a backyard telescope. This was different. This was the Pentagon's own data released from the deepest vaults of the Department of Defense. And you were no longer a passive observer looking at a speculative drawing or hearing a second-hand account. Suddenly you were in the cockpit of an F/A-18 Super Hornet, the most advanced fighter jet on the planet, flying alongside the most elite aviators in the world. You were seeing what they saw, hearing what they heard, feeling their professional composure fray and unravel into pure, unadulterated astonishment. The first piece of evidence, filmed in 2004, but held in secret for 13 years, would come to be known simply as FLIR, one or more famously the Tic Tac video. Imagine yourself off the coast of San Diego, inside the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, a city of naval power conducting training exercises in a highly controlled, monitored airspace. For 2 weeks, the most sophisticated radar system in the world, the SPY-1, aboard the USS Princeton, had been tracking bizarre objects. They would appear instantly at 80,000 feet far above the operational ceiling of any known aircraft, and then plummet to just above the ocean surface in a matter of seconds. They would hover motionless, then accelerate to hypersonic speeds. They were playing a game with the laws of physics, and they were winning. Finally, Commander David Fravor, the decorated squadron leader of the Black Aces, was sent to intercept. What he and his wingman, Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, encountered was something that had no business existing. The video you see is what his wingman's jet captured. It's a grainy monochrome world seen through the lens of an advanced targeting pod. There against the cold digital grey hangs a shape that mocks every chapter ever written on aerodynamics. It's smooth, white oblong with no wings, no tail, no rotors, and most unnervingly no heat signature from an engine. A perfect tic-tac 40 feet long suspended against the vast emptiness of the sky. You hear the voices of the naval aviators, their words a clinical staccato trying to mask a rising tide of incredulity. There's a whole fleet of them, one pilot says, referencing the multiple radar contacts. My gosh, another breathes. The object pivots, turns, and mirrors the movements of Fravor's jet with an intelligence that is palpable. As Fravor descended to get a closer look, it accelerated in a way he later described as like a bullet fired from a gun vanishing in an instant. Less than a minute later, the USS Princeton reacquired the target. It was now 60 miles away, waiting for them at their precise rendezvous point. This single incident, this one encounter, was an ontological shock. It wasn't just an anomaly, it was a flagrant violation of reality as we knew it. Here you had 4 of the most highly trained observers on Earth, backed by billions of dollars of military hardware, all bearing witness to the same impossible event. They were not seeing swamp gas. They were not misidentifying a weather balloon. They were engaging with a technology that was, by any sober analysis, centuries ahead of our own. The Tic Tac displayed no visible means of propulsion, yet it could out-accelerate a fighter jet. It showed no control surfaces, yet it could perform instantaneous changes in direction that would crush any human pilot under unbearable G-forces. It moved from the vacuum of near space to the dense air above the sea with no discernible effect. This wasn't just an unidentified flying object. This was a flying object that was actively, aggressively, and successfully rewriting the rulebook of physics right before our eyes. For 13 years, Fravor's story and the incredible data that backed it up was buried a classified secret known only to a select few. But with its release in 2017, the world was now in on the secret. The dam of denial had begun to crack. Then came the other videos, each one a new chapter in this unfolding revelation, each adding another layer of impossibility. The second video, codenamed Gimbal, filmed in 2015 off the coast of Florida, presented an entirely different kind of puzzle. This time the object is a flattened disc glowing hot against the cold clouds. It flies against a gale force headwind without slowing its movement, utterly serene and unaffected. The sophisticated automatic target recognition system on the F/A-18 struggles to classify it, the software cycling through possibilities before giving up. It is a ghost in its own targeting system. And then the object does something extraordinary. It performs a slow, controlled 180-degree rotation along its central axis, like a spinning top lying on its side, all while continuing its forward flight. The maneuver is so clean, so precise, so aerodynamically baffling that it elicits a torrent of excited, confused chatter from the pilots. Their voices, raw and unfiltered, are perhaps the most compelling evidence of all. This is not the calm, detached language of a routine training exercise. This is the sound of professionals confronting the sublime. "Look at that thing, dude," one exclaims, his voice electric with a mixture of awe and alarm. "It's rotating." The instruments confirm what their eyes are seeing, but their minds can barely process it. As they watch, the object stabilizes, and then the pilot drops another bombshell, a line that chills you to the bone. There's a whole fleet of them. The sensor operator confirms, "My gosh." On their radar, a group of similar objects previously unseen materializes. The gimbal object was not alone. It was one of a squadron. This wasn't a solitary vehicle on a test flight. This suggested a coordinated, intelligent presence operating with impunity in the training grounds of the United States Navy. It was a direct challenge, a display of technological superiority so profound it bordered on the magical. The rotation itself, the gimbal movement, seemed almost like a demonstration, a flourish, as if the craft was deliberately showing off a capability we couldn't even begin to comprehend. The final video, Go Fast, also from 2015, was perhaps the most viscerally startling. It shows a small round object skimming low over the surface of the ocean at breathtaking speed. The pilots struggle to get a lock. The numbers on the heads-up display tell an unbelievable story of velocity and low altitude. What makes this so profound is not just the speed, but the environment. To move that fast through the dense air just above the water would require an incredible amount of energy, and it should create a massive heat signature and a turbulent wake. Yet like the Tic Tac, the Go Fast object displays no discernible propulsion system, no exhaust, no thermal bloom. It slices through the air as if the air isn't there, seemingly negating friction and inertia itself. The pilot's laughter is not one of amusement, but of pure, dumbfounded disbelief. It's the sound you make when your entire framework for understanding the world shatters in an instant. "Whoa, got it," one pilot shouts as he finally achieves a shaky lock. What the expletive is that his counterpart asks. It is the question that now hung over the entire Department of Defense. These three videos, FLIR, One Gimbal and Go Fast, became the incontrovertible proof. They were the holy trinity of the new era of UAP disclosure. They were not blurry amateur footage. They were official United States government records, captured by military-grade sensors and corroborated by the testimony of impeccable eyewitnesses. The release of this trifecta of evidence acted as a social and political catalyst. Decades of stigma, carefully cultivated by official denial and cultural ridicule, evaporated almost overnight. You could no longer dismiss Commander David Fravor, a graduate of the Top Gun Naval Aviation School with thousands of hours of flight time as a crank. You could no longer wave away the targeting pod footage from a billion-dollar fighter jet as a simple misidentification. The conversation shifted irrevocably. The joke was over. The subject was no longer funny. It was deadly serious. And behind the release of the videos, a name emerged from the shadows: Luis Elizondo. A career counterintelligence special agent who had worked on sensitive operations in Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay. Elizondo claimed he had been the director of a secret Pentagon program established to investigate these very phenomena. The program, he revealed, was the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP. It was funded at the behest of senators like Harry Reid, with tens of millions of dollars in so-called black money buried deep within the defense budget. For years, from 2007 to 2012, and unofficially beyond AATIP, had been quietly collecting the data, interviewing the pilots, and analyzing the evidence far from public view. Elizondo's resignation from the Pentagon in October 2017 was a protest, a final desperate attempt to force his superiors to take the threat seriously. The New York Times article was the culmination of that effort, a calculated move to bring the secret out into the light. The Pentagon's initial response was a study in institutional whiplash and bureaucratic reticence. At first, they were cagey, trying to downplay the significance. They confirmed that AATIP existed, but claimed it had been terminated in 2012. They acknowledged the videos were authentic Navy footage, but offered no explanation for what they depicted. This cautious, almost grudging confirmation was in itself a monumental shift. For the first time in modern history, the Department of Defense was publicly admitting two things. First, that these objects were real and not misidentifications, and second, that they represented a phenomenon worthy of a formal funded investigation. The days of Project Blue Book's theatrical dismissals were over. This was a new reality. The verisimilitude of the pilot testimonies was simply too powerful to ignore. These were not casual observers. These were men and women entrusted with the nation's most advanced military hardware individuals, whose ability to observe, identify, and act decisively is a matter of life and death. When they said they saw something that defied explanation, their words carried the weight of their immense credibility. Pressure began to build not just from the public, but from within the government itself. Pilots, now feeling emboldened, began to come forward, sharing their own stories that had been suppressed for years. The sheer number of military encounters, it turned out, was far greater than anyone had imagined. These were not rare once-in-a-generation events. They were happening regularly, often in sensitive military training areas and near nuclear assets. The narrative was reframed. This was no longer a question of, are we alone in the universe, a philosophical debate for scientists and dreamers. It had become a stark and urgent matter of national security. Something unknown, something with capabilities far beyond our own, was operating with impunity in restricted United States airspace. It was demonstrating the ability to neutralize our most advanced radar systems, to outmaneuver our fastest jets, and to operate in ways that suggested a complete mastery of physics that we did not possess. The implications were staggering. If this technology was of terrestrial origin from a rival nation like Russia or China, it would mean that the United States had been leapfrogged technologically to a degree that was almost unimaginable, a failure of intelligence on a catastrophic scale. It would mean that a potential adversary held a decisive, perhaps insurmountable military advantage. But if the technology was not terrestrial, the implications were even more profound, touching upon the very core of our place in the cosmos. The Pentagon and the entire intelligence community was trapped in a paradox. To admit the former was to confess a crippling military and intelligence failure. To even consider the latter was to step into a world that for 70 years they had told everyone did not exist. They could no longer dismiss it. They could no longer laugh it off. The evidence was now public, the witnesses were credible, and the questions were being asked in the halls of Congress. The dam of secrecy breached in December 2017 had now utterly collapsed. But what poured forth was not a clear stream of answers, but a murky, turbulent flood of even more profound questions. The conversation had been forced, the taboo broken, but the mystery had only deepened. We now knew with certainty that we were facing a genuine, tangible phenomenon, characterized by technology that we could not explain, duplicate, or defend against. The Pentagon's hand had been forced. The era of denial was over, and a new, uncertain era of official engagement had begun. But this was only the start of the inquiry. The crucial questions still remained hanging in the air, with the same unnerving presence as the objects themselves. What precisely were the 5 observables, the key performance characteristics that these craft consistently demonstrated? What did the complete data, the parts we weren't being shown, actually reveal? And the most fundamental question of, all the one that now haunted every pilot, every analyst, and every policymaker who dared to look at the evidence with open eyes, what was this technology, and infinitely more important, whose was it? And so we looked for answers in our own skies, combing through terabytes of sensor data, replaying the ghostly signatures of objects that defied our known physics. We listened to the pilots, men and women at the razor's edge of our technology, whose sworn testimony challenged the very foundations of our materialist worldview. Yet in our intense focus on the phenomena immediately above our heads, we may have missed the most profound clue of all. The answer, or at least the catalyst for a new chapter of questions, didn't come from our atmosphere. It arrived from a place of unimaginable distance and darkness. It came from the stars. The story begins, as these tales so often do, with a quiet act of vigilance. On the night of February 28, 2020, the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, or ATLAS, was performing its nightly duty. A robotic network of telescopes, it stands as our silent, sleepless guardian, scanning the heavens for any rogue object on a collision course with Earth. It is a system built to anticipate threats, to calculate trajectories and predict futures. But on this night it found something it was never designed to understand. A faint, unremarkable smudge of light moving with purpose against the stellar backdrop. At first it was logged as just another comet given the provisional name C 2019Y4. The initial calculations, however, soon revealed an astonishing truth. This smudge of light was not one of ours. It was a refugee from another solar system. Its trajectory was a hyperbola, a gravitational arc so extreme it could only mean one thing: it was not bound to our Sunday. It was merely passing through a tourist on a journey that began in the dark abyss between the stars, long before our species ever looked up in wonder. This was only the second time in human history we had ever confirmed such a visitor. The first, the enigmatic Oumuamua, had already rewritten the rules of what was possible, a bizarre cigar-shaped enigma that tumbled through our system and accelerated away without any visible reason. Now we had another. We named it 3I, Atlas, the third interstellar object ever detected, and astronomers across the globe trained their instruments on it, hungry for data. Here was a chance to study a pristine piece of another star system, a cosmic time capsule carrying secrets of its alien birthplace. But the more we looked, the less sense it made. From the very beginning, 3I, Atlas, was a paradox, a celestial contradiction that seemed to revel in its own mystery. Its light curve, the rhythmic pulse of its reflected brightness, was the first clue that something was deeply strange. Instead of a steady, predictable wobble from a rotating solid body, its brightness fluctuated wildly erratically. It was as if we were watching a broken mirror tumbling through space, its fragments catching the sun at odd, unpredictable intervals. This behavior suggested a fragile, perhaps loosely bound object. The consensus quickly formed that it must be an interstellar comet, a dirty snowball ejected from its home star eons ago. Comets are notoriously unstable. As they approach the sun, the intense heat and radiation vaporize their ices, a process called outgassing, which creates the beautiful coma and tail we associate with them. This outgassing can also act like a tiny, unpredictable rocket engine, causing the non-gravitational acceleration that had so puzzled scientists observing Oumuamua. With 3I, Atlas, we finally had a chance to see this process up close, to confirm that these interstellar visitors were indeed just comets. We watched and we waited for the show to begin. As it raced toward the inner solar system, its brightness grew exponentially far faster than any typical comet. By March, it was shining with an intensity hundreds of times greater than when it was discovered, promising to become a spectacular naked-eye object, a once-in-a-generation celestial event. The astronomical community was electric with anticipation. And then, just as it was reaching its crescendo, the performance abruptly stopped. In early April, the brilliant point of light began to dim. It didn't just fade, it fractured. Through the world's most powerful telescopes, we watched in astonishment as the object broke apart. The single bright nucleus dissolved into a ghostly chain of smaller, fainter fragments, a string of pearls slowly drifting away from each other. The great interstellar comet, the brilliant visitor from afar, had died before our very eyes. It had disintegrated. On the surface, this seemed to solve the mystery. Comets are fragile. This one was especially so. It got too close to the sun's celestial blowtorch, and it fell apart, case closed. But for a dedicated group of scientists, the how of its death was far more perplexing than the death itself. The fragmentation was not explosive as one might expect from a volatile pocket of ice suddenly sublimating. It was gentle. The pieces weren't violently thrown clear. They simply drifted apart with the speed of a slow walk. It was less of a celestial explosion and more of a quiet, deliberate disassembly. Furthermore, the data returned from spectroscopy, the analysis of its chemical makeup, was deeply puzzling. While it showed some signs of cometary gases like cyanogen, it seemed to be remarkably dust-poor. The spectacular tail we expected from such a catastrophic breakup never truly materialized. It was a ghost comet, its death leaving behind more questions than answers. The scientific community splintered. One camp held fast to the Occam's razor explanation. It was simply a very strange, very fragile comet, a type we had never seen before because it came from a completely different stellar environment. Perhaps in its home system, comets were built differently with more volatile ices that allowed them to disintegrate in this gentle, peculiar way. It was a plausible theory, one that required no great leaps of faith, only an expansion of our existing models. It was the safe harbour of conventional wisdom, a comfortable place to anchor our understanding. But there was another camp, a smaller, more speculative group for whom the gentle breakup, the bizarre light curve, and the dust-poor composition pointed toward a far more radical conclusion. They asked a question that felt deeply uncomfortable, a question that pushed the boundaries of scientific inquiry. What if 3I Atlas wasn't a natural object at all? What if its strange behavior wasn't due to exotic ice chemistry, but to an artificial structure? They pointed out that an extremely thin, lightweight object, a solar sail for instance, or the fragmented hull of a long-dead probe, might behave in precisely this way. It would be fragile, susceptible to solar radiation pressure, and could break apart gently under thermal stress. Its erratic light curve could be explained by a collection of flat reflective shards tumbling in the sunlight. This was of course the same controversial argument that had been levelled at Oumuamua, but now there were two of them. Two unprecedented interstellar visitors, both exhibiting characteristics that, while not impossible for natural objects, were also consistent with artificiality. Two data points are not a coincidence. They are the beginning of a pattern. Suddenly, the problem of 3I Atlas transcended the halls of astronomy. It became a question of planetary security, a jurisdictional nightmare for the very institutions we task with keeping us safe. Think about the challenge this object presented. For NASA, it was a scientific marvel, an object of pure research to be studied and debated in academic journals. Its origins, whether natural or artificial, were a matter of profound cosmic significance. But for the United States Space Force and the intelligence community, the calculus was entirely different. An unknown object originating from outside our solar system and moving on a trajectory that intersected our planetary neighbourhood is not a scientific curiosity. It is a track of interest. It is an unknown. And in the world of national defence, unknown is synonymous with potential threat. The ambiguity of 3I Atlas laid bare a terrifying gap in our institutional architecture. Who is in charge of such an object? Is it a NASA problem or a Department of Defense problem? Does it fall under the purview of planetary defense against asteroids, or does it belong to the new guardians of our orbital space? The protocols simply didn't exist. We have systems for tracking asteroids, for monitoring adversary satellites, and now for cataloguing reports of unusual phenomena in our own atmosphere. But we had no coherent interagency framework for an object that was simultaneously all and none of these things. 3I Atlas was a celestial Rorschach test. What you saw depended entirely on who you were and what you were tasked to protect. To an astronomer, it was a fragmented comet. To a defense analyst, it was an uncontrolled high-velocity object of unknown origin and unknown capability. To the architects of our national security strategy, it was a glaring system-wide failure of imagination. This object and the deep, unsettling ambiguity surrounding it became a critical piece of the puzzle you see unfolding today. It landed on the same desks in the Pentagon as the Navy's Tic Tac videos. It was briefed in the same secure facilities where analysts were struggling to make sense of the gimbal and go-fast encounters. And in those rooms, a powerful realization began to dawn. The UAP problem was not just about strange things flying in our airspace. That was only one symptom of a much larger, more profound condition, our inability to adequately process, classify, and respond to phenomena that fall outside our existing categories of understanding. The high strangeness factor of 3I Atlas, its complete refusal to be neatly boxed as either natural comet or harmless asteroid, directly mirrored the high strangeness of the objects encountered by our fighter pilots. Both defied simple explanation. Both exposed the limitations of our sensors and our analytical models. Both raised uncomfortable questions that our bureaucracy was ill-equipped to answer. For the Pentagon, 3I Atlas was a stress test delivered from the depths of interstellar space. It proved with chilling certainty that our definitions were too narrow, our jurisdictions too siloed, and our awareness too focused on the space between the ground and the stratosphere. The threat, or simply the phenomenon, could come from anywhere. This is why the language in the new directives began to change. The acronym UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, was quietly but deliberately retired. It was replaced by a new, far broader term, Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena. The aerial was gone. The domain was no longer limited to the sky. It was now officially expanded to include space and even the world's oceans. This was not a mere semantic adjustment. It was a revolution in strategic thinking, a direct admission that the mystery was bigger than we had ever publicly acknowledged. The catalyst for this profound shift wasn't just a grainy infrared video of an object off the coast of San Diego. It was also the silent, ghostly death of an interstellar traveler millions of miles away. 3I Atlas forced the Pentagon to look up past the clouds, past the orbits of our own satellites, and to confront the humbling reality that our solar system had just been proven to be a very public thoroughfare. The question was no longer simply what is in our skies. The question, now codified in the foundational documents of our national security apparatus, had become what is in our universe and how do we prepare for what comes next. The decision to expand the definition was the first crucial step. It was an acknowledgement of the problem, but an acknowledgement is not a solution. It is merely the opening of a door. What lay behind that door was a labyrinth of political infighting, budgetary battles, and fierce institutional resistance. Changing a single word on a piece of paper was one thing. Building an entirely new office staffed with people empowered to hunt for answers across the entire spectrum of government secrecy was another battle entirely. The creation of that office, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, would become one of the most fascinating and contentious hidden stories in the recent history of the Pentagon. It was a war fought not with missiles and jets, but with memos, briefings, and backroom negotiations, a war to decide who would ultimately own the truth. The echoes of 3I, Atlas, did not fade with its departure. Instead, they reverberated through the most secure corridors of power, shaking loose a generation of denial and classified silence. The object from interstellar space had been a catalyst, a cosmic permission slip for the United States government to finally publicly admit the scale of its own bewilderment. The result was not a confession, nor was it a revelation. It was a document, an updated report on unidentified anomalous phenomena, delivered with the dry clinical precision of a coroner's findings. But this was no autopsy of a dead mystery. It was the official birth certificate of a new and terrifyingly complex reality. For those of us who had watched the skies, who had tracked the strange journey of our interstellar visitor, this report was the first official tremor from a seismic shift happening deep within the establishment. It landed not with a bang, but with the quiet, heavy thud of bureaucracy acknowledging the inexplicable. Within its meticulously organized pages, devoid of speculation and emotion, lay a portrait of a government grappling with a profound intellectual crisis. The report was a masterclass in strategic ambiguity, a carefully constructed vessel designed to hold an impossible truth without shattering. It confirmed a dramatic surge in sightings, hundreds of new cases now vetted and logged since the previous assessment, many re-evaluated through the stark new lens provided by the 3I Atlas encounter. What was once dismissed as sensor ghosts or pilot error was now being catalogued with a grim seriousness. The document read like a field guide to the unknown, categorizing encounters by their observable characteristics: instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocities without thermal signatures, transmedium travel, the seamless transition from air to sea. But for every data point it offered, it carved out a dozen new questions. The pages were riddled with blacked-out paragraphs, redactions, that felt less like the protection of sources and methods and more like gaping wounds in our understanding voids where the most critical information should have been. This updated assessment, intended as a step toward transparency, had the paradoxical effect of making the mystery feel deeper, more intractable, and infinitely more vast. It was an admission that the very system designed to protect the nation, its multi-trillion-dollar network of satellites, radar installations, and elite pilots, was routinely encountering objects it could not identify, could not intercept, and could not comprehend. The report became a mirror, reflecting not the nature of the phenomena, but the profound limitations of our own perception and technology. It revealed a government caught on the horns of a trilemma, a three-pronged enigma from which there was no easy escape. Each potential explanation was as problematic and unsettling as the last, creating deep fissures within the very intelligence and scientific communities tasked with finding an answer. The first, and for the Pentagon most palatable possibility, was that these UAP represented a breathtaking technological leap by a terrestrial adversary. This was the explanation they could understand, the one that fit neatly into the familiar paradigms of espionage and defense. The fear that China or Russia had secretly developed a new form of propulsion, perhaps based on principles of physics we had yet to master, was a tangible and actionable threat. It fueled budget requests, spurred black project research, and gave the problem a terrestrial anchor. Analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency worked tirelessly attempting to connect UAP sightings to known Russian submarine patrols or Chinese satellite launches. They searched for correlations, for patterns that would betray a human hand at the controls, a geopolitical strategy behind the aerial maneuvers. This was the devil they knew, a spectre of conventional warfare evolved into something terrifyingly new. Yet the data stubbornly refused to cooperate. The flight characteristics observed in the most compelling cases documented by the advanced AN/SPY-6 radar on Aegis destroyers and the sophisticated sensor suites of FA-18 Super Hornets were not just an evolutionary step beyond our own capabilities. They appeared to be a wholesale violation of them. Physicists contracted by the government to review the data were blunt in their classified briefings. The observed accelerations would subject any known material and any conceivable biological pilot to G-forces that would tear them apart. The lack of heat blooms, sonic booms, or visible means of propulsion was not merely stealthy, it was, according to our current understanding of thermodynamics and aerodynamics, physically impossible. To accept the adversary theory was to accept that a rival nation was not just 5 or 10 years ahead of the United States, but 500. It would mean they possessed a grasp of physics that would make nuclear weapons look like primitive firecrackers, a capability they had somehow developed, tested, and deployed on a global scale without leaving a single discernible trace of their research and development infrastructure. The adversary hypothesis, while comforting in its familiarity, began to feel like a threadbare blanket too small to cover the chilling scope of the evidence. If the hand of man seemed an unlikely fit, then perhaps the answer lay in the hand of nature. The second horn of the trilemma was the possibility that we were witnessing a collection of undiscovered, complex, and deeply strange natural phenomena. This was the safe harbor for many in the mainstream scientific community, a rational port in a storm of unbelievable speculation. Proponents of this view argued that the universe is under no obligation to be simple or intuitive. They proposed that rare atmospheric conditions, perhaps involving interacting layers of charged plasma or novel forms of atmospheric electricity, could create sensor readings that mimic structured craft. Ball lightning, a phenomenon still not fully understood, was often cited as an example of nature's ability to produce baffling and ethereal displays. Atmospheric lensing, where layers of air at different temperatures bend light, and radar waves could potentially explain some visual and electronic oddities, creating mirages of astonishing clarity and speed. These scientists argued that our sensors, calibrated to detect known threats like planes and missiles, were simply being fooled by natural events operating outside their design parameters. They were seeing phantoms, high-tech ghosts, born from a confluence of electromagnetism and weather. This explanation provided a neat and tidy off-ramp from the more disturbing possibilities, and it undoubtedly accounted for a significant percentage of the more ambiguous sightings. But like the adversary theory, it began to fray when stretched across the fabric of the high-quality cases. How could a plasma ball execute a perfect grid search pattern over a naval carrier strike group? How could an atmospheric lens exhibit what pilots described as intelligent, responsive behavior, seeming to react to their presence and maneuvers? And most critically, how could any known natural phenomenon achieve transmedium capability? moving from the thin upper atmosphere to the crushing pressure of the deep ocean without any discernible change in form or velocity. The updated report itself implicitly acknowledged this shortcoming. It included cases where multiple sensor systems, radar, infrared, and optical, all captured the same inexplicable object simultaneously. This was not a single sensor glitch. This was a physically present, empirically verified times something, times that behaved in ways no cloud of plasma or trick of the light ever could. To attribute it all to nature was to demand of the natural world a level of coordinated, intelligent mimicry that bordered on the fantastical itself. It required a belief in a form of nature far more organized and purposeful than our science had ever countenanced. And so the government found itself backed into the third and most terrifying corner of the room, the other category. It was the report's great unspoken abyss. This was the catch-all bin for the incidents that defied both terrestrial and conventional natural explanations. It was a statistical black hole, small in percentage, but possessing an immense gravitational pull that warped the entire conversation. Within the Pentagon and the intelligence community, this category was referred to in hushed tones, sometimes with gallows humor, as the Oz file. It represented the complete breakdown of all known analytical frameworks. These were the cases like the infamous 2004 Nimitz encounters, where highly credible observers and multiple advanced sensors tracked structured objects, performing maneuvers that were, for lack of a better word, magical. This was the data that kept generals awake at night and sent physicists back to their whiteboards in frustration. The existence of this category, formally acknowledged in an official government document, was the true legacy of 3I, Atlas. Our interstellar visitor had cracked the door open just enough for the political will to form, allowing the system to admit that this other bin was not empty. It was in fact growing. And it presented a challenge that was not merely technical, but existential. How do you prepare for a threat you cannot define? How do you create a defense against something that does not obey the laws of physics as you understand them? The other category was an intellectual vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed every fear, every hope, and every wild speculation that humanity has ever held about its place in the cosmos. It was here, in this classified data dump of the truly impossible, that the real work and the real conflict began. The report did not solve a mystery. It merely gave it an official designation, and in doing so unleashed a quiet but ferocious intellectual civil war within the very institutions sworn to protect us. The fallout from the report's release was not a public panic, but a slow, grinding internal friction that threatened to paralyze the entire investigative effort. The core of the problem was data, not a lack of it, but a chaotic, unmanageable deluge. The military's data collection systems were a marvel of engineering, but they were never designed for this. They were built to identify a MiG-29, not a silent tic-tac-shaped object that could drop from 80,000 feet to sea level in less than a second. The sensors were exquisite, but specialized, each speaking its own unique digital language. A Navy ship's SPY radar collects data differently than an Air Force F-22's AESA array, which is different again from the spectral analysis captured by a National Reconnaissance Office satellite. The challenge of time's sensor fusion times, of taking these disparate streams of information and weaving them into a single coherent picture of an event, was proving to be a monumental, perhaps insurmountable task. Analysts were drowning in a sea of noise, hunting for the faint, elusive signal of the anomalous. For every genuine UAP event, there were 1,000 false positives, atmospheric clutter, flocks of birds, software glitches, and sophisticated enemy electronic warfare designed to spoof our systems. The signal-to-noise ratio was abysmal. Compounding this was the ever-present wall of classification. The most compelling data, the information that could potentially crack the entire mystery open, was often locked away in the most secure digital vaults designated under special access programs. An analyst at the new All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, might need data from a Navy submarine, an Air Force drone, and a CIA source to understand a single incident. But each piece of that puzzle was held by a different agency, each with its own culture of secrecy and its own justification for why its data was too sensitive to share. The investigation was being crippled by the very system of compartmentalization designed to protect national security. It was an epistemological crisis born of red tape, a labyrinth of bureaucracy where the truth was the ultimate casualty. This data bottleneck fueled the growing conflict between the two emerging factions within the government's response. On one side stood the pragmatists, the military operators, the intelligence officers, the Pentagon brass. For them, this was fundamentally a threat assessment problem. Their perspective was forged in the unforgiving crucible of combat and geopolitics. They were the nuts and bolts crowd. They wanted to know what these things were, where they came from, what their capabilities were, and what their intentions might be. They were impatient with ambiguity and academic debate. The sight of an unidentified object effortlessly disabling the fire control radar of an entire carrier strike group was not a scientific curiosity. It was a catastrophic failure of national defense. Their demand was for actionable intelligence, for answers that could be translated into doctrine, into weapons systems, into a strategy for engagement. They pushed for a more aggressive posture, for protocols on when and how to engage these objects, a prospect that terrified many. On the other side stood the scientists, a cohort of physicists, astronomers, and engineers, increasingly being brought into the fold from NASA, national laboratories, and academia. They viewed the problem through a completely different lens. For them, this was the most profound scientific discovery in human history, unfolding in slow motion. Their watchwords were rigor, methodology, and peer review. They were appalled by the military's rush to judgment, arguing that you could not treat a potential paradigm shift in physics like an enemy bomber. They pleaded for patience, for a slow, methodical signal of record approach. This meant collecting baseline data over years, perhaps decades. It meant designing and deploying new sensor platforms specifically calibrated to study the phenomenon free from the biases and limitations of military hardware. They argued that any conclusion reached with the current polluted dataset would be worthless, a scientific house built on sand. For them, the greatest risk was not a surprise attack, but a catastrophic misinterpretation of the data, of mistaking a natural phenomenon for a hostile act, or worse, of contaminating the greatest discovery of all time with fear and paranoia. These two worlds collided in sterile, windowless, sensitive, compartmented information facilities, or SCIFs. The culture clash was palpable. Fighter pilots, men and women of action, would describe their harrowing encounters with a visceral, chilling clarity, their testimony filled with the hard-earned instincts of aerial combat. They would then be cross-examined by physicists who would patiently explain that their eyewitness accounts, however compelling, were anecdotal. The scientists would talk of instrument calibration, of error bars, and of the need for repeatable experiments, while the generals would counter with urgent questions about reaction times and rules of engagement. It was a dialogue of the deaf, a fundamental conflict between the urgent need to times act times and the methodical need to times understand asterisk. The UAP report, in its stark and clinical honesty, had revealed the unknown to the world, but in doing so, it had also revealed the deep, painful divisions in how we as a species are equipped to confront it. The system was straining, caught in an impossible tug-of-war between its duty to protect and its newfound mandate to explore. The old institutional antibodies, the decades of ridicule and automatic dismissal of this topic, were being slowly overcome, but the new framework was fragile, underfunded, and torn by internal dissent. The Pentagon had updated its report, but it had not yet updated its soul. It was an organization built for terrestrial conflicts, for definable enemies and predictable physics. Now it was being forced to confront a phenomenon that seemed to mock those very foundations. The question that lingered in the air long after the report was filed away was whether an apparatus designed for war could ever truly be repurposed for discovery. As the data continued to pour in from satellites in orbit, from submarines in the abyss, and from the cockpits of our most advanced aircraft, the challenge became agonizingly clear. We had finally officially acknowledged the mystery, but we had no idea how to solve it, and we were running out of time to learn. And so we are left staring at the ghost of 3I, Atlas, that silent, impossible messenger from the interstellar dark. It is tempting, profoundly so, to see this single bewildering event as the catalyst, the final undeniable piece of evidence that broke the dam of official silence. We imagine a room deep within the Pentagon where grainy satellite data of this cosmic interloper finally forced a reluctant admission, a turning point compelled by one spectacular visitor. But the truth, as is so often the case with the slow, grinding gears of history and bureaucracy, is far more complex, far more human, and ultimately far more revealing. The recent update to the Pentagon's UAP report was not the result of a single celestial thunderclap. It was the culmination of a long, slow-building seismic pressure, a convergence of forces that made the old posture of denial and dismissal not just untenable, but a strategic liability. 3I, Atlas, was not the cause. It was perhaps the final resonant tremor that made the world notice the ground was already shifting beneath its feet. To truly understand why the walls came down, we must look away from the stars for a moment and turn our gaze back towards the people who watch them for us, to the pilots, the radar operators, and the intelligence officers whose own impossible testimonies had been accumulating for decades, forming a repository of evidence too heavy to remain hidden. For years, these accounts existed as whispers in ready rooms, as redacted case files buried in forgotten archives, as career-ending anecdotes best left unspoken. But a whisper, when joined by another and another and another, eventually becomes a roar. The critical mass was reached not through a single sighting, but through the undeniable compounding weight of human credibility. These were not unreliable narrators. You have heard their stories. These were the products of the most rigorous military training on Earth. Men and women entrusted with $100 million aircraft tasked with defending the nation's airspace. They are selected for their sharp eyesight, their lightning-fast reflexes, and above all for their cool, dispassionate observational skills under extreme pressure. Commander David Fravor, the Top Gun graduate who engaged the Tic Tac off the coast of San Diego, is not a man given to flights of fancy. His wingman, Commander Alex Dietrich, corroborated every detail. The radar operators on the USS Princeton, career professionals like Senior Chief Kevin Day, tracked these objects for weeks, their advanced SPY-1 systems painting a picture of performance characteristics that defied the known laws of physics. These were not isolated incidents, they were patterns. A chorus of the most trusted voices in the national security apparatus, all singing the same unbelievable song from different locations at different times over a span of years. To continue dismissing them was to suggest a mass-synchronized delusion among the military's finest. It was to imply that the very people selected to be our most reliable observers of reality were in fact the least reliable. This created a deep internal paradox for the Department of Defense. An institution built on trust on the chain of command and on the integrity of its personnel was being forced to actively distrust its own. The psychological and moral toll of this stance began to fester. How can you ask a pilot to risk their life in a supersonic jet, yet simultaneously invalidate their most profound and perplexing professional experience? The persistence of these witnesses, men like Ryan Graves and his squadron who encountered these objects daily off the Virginia coast, became a moral and ethical forcing function. Their willingness to go on the record to risk their careers and reputations transformed the issue from a fringe curiosity into a matter of institutional integrity. The Pentagon wasn't just being confronted with strange lights in the sky, it was being confronted by the unwavering testimony of its own people, and that is a force that no amount of classification or ridicule can indefinitely contain. The foundation of the old secrecy was eroding not from the outside in, but from the inside out, washed away by a relentless tide of credible human experience. Beyond this crisis of conscience, a colder, more pragmatic reality was asserting itself in the classified briefing rooms of Washington, D.C. National security is a game of capabilities and intentions. The fundamental terrifying problem with these UAPs was that we understood neither. For decades, the dominant fear was that these objects represented a secret leap-ahead technology developed by a terrestrial adversary like Russia or China. If that were true, it would signify an intelligence failure of catastrophic proportions, a technological surprise on a scale far exceeding Sputnik. It would mean that a rival power possessed craft that could fly with impunity into our most sensitive, restricted military airspace, loiter over nuclear aircraft carrier strike groups, and outmaneuver our most advanced fighter jets with ease. The implications are chilling. an aircraft that can accelerate instantaneously without visible means of propulsion or aerodynamic control surfaces and exhibit low observability across multiple sensor platforms, is not merely a next-generation fighter. It is a paradigm-breaking weapon system that renders entire defensive networks obsolete. It's a queen on a chessboard where you only have pawns. But as the data accumulated and as the performance characteristics were analyzed, a second, even more unsettling possibility began to emerge. What if it wasn't the Russians or the Chinese? The sheer energy requirements to perform the maneuvers witnessed by pilots like Fravor are, by our current understanding of physics, astronomical. The materials required to withstand the associated G-forces without disintegrating are unknown to our science. The propulsion systems are silent, invisible, and seemingly non-existent. The possibility had to be considered that these objects were not merely a generation ahead, but many generations, perhaps originating from a technological lineage entirely separate from our own. From a purely defense planning perspective, this is the ultimate strategic nightmare. It's not just an unknown capability, it's an unknowable one. You cannot defend against a threat you cannot comprehend. You cannot deter an actor whose intentions are a complete mystery. These objects demonstrated what the Pentagon calls trans-medium travel, moving seamlessly from the air into the sea. They demonstrated hypersonic velocities without sonic booms. They demonstrated cloaking capabilities appearing and disappearing from advanced radar systems at will. The incursions were a direct, undeniable challenge to the sovereignty of United States airspace. Imagine a foreign submarine sitting undetected off the coast of Norfolk. The response would be immediate and overwhelming. Yet for years, objects of unknown origin were performing far more brazen acts in the skies above our naval fleets, and the official response was a systemic shrug. This could not continue. The risk of miscalculation was too high. What if a UAP was mistaken for a Chinese drone or vice versa during a period of high tension? The potential for accidental escalation was and is immense. The lack of a standardized reporting protocol meant there was no way to quickly differentiate a truly anomalous object from a classified domestic drone, a foreign intelligence platform, or even sensor malfunctions. The sky was filled with dangerous blind spots. The national security apparatus therefore faced an existential imperative. It had to get a handle on the problem. It had to know what was in its skies. The updated report was not an act of gentle disclosure. It was a desperate, necessary move to regain situational awareness over the nation's own sovereign territory. It was an admission that for a very long time we had not been in control. To regain that control, the Pentagon had to solve a deep-seated cultural problem that it had itself created. For over 70 years, the official policy on this subject had been a carefully constructed wall of ridicule and professional intimidation. The giggle factor, as it came to be known, was a powerful and effective tool of suppression. Pilots knew that filing a report about a strange object that didn't fit known profiles was a career-ending move. They would be seen as unreliable, unstable, or worse. They would be grounded, sent for psychological evaluation, and quietly pushed out of the cockpit and onto a desk. This created a vicious and self-defeating cycle of ignorance, because pilots were afraid to report there was no official data. Because there was no official data, the subject had no official reality. Because it had no official reality, any pilot who reported it was deemed unreliable. It was a perfect closed loop of institutional blindness. The system designed to gather intelligence was actively incentivizing its personnel to withhold it. The leadership within the intelligence community and the Department of Defense eventually belatedly recognized this fundamental flaw. They came to understand that they were operating with a self-inflicted wound, a massive data deficit on a critical national security issue. They had no idea of the true scale of the problem, because their own culture had systematically silenced the primary witnesses. The 2021 preliminary assessment and the subsequent updates were at their core a bureaucratic attempt to break this cycle. The establishment of AARO, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, and the creation of standardized secure reporting channels for military and civilian pilots was a message sent down the chain of command: it is now safe to talk. It was a form of institutional amnesty. It was a signal that these reports would no longer be career killers, but would instead be treated as valuable intelligence contributions. The goal was to open the floodgates to encourage the thousands of pilots, air traffic controllers, and sensor operators who had stayed silent for years or even decades to finally come forward with their data. This was not about validating past accounts so much as it was about building a future database. Without robust high-fidelity data, you cannot begin to perform a scientific analysis. You cannot distinguish patterns from noise. You cannot task our multi-billion-dollar intelligence assets, our satellites, our advanced radars, our signals intelligence platforms to look for something if you haven't first defined what it is you are looking for. The updated reporting guidelines were the essential first step in transforming the UAP issue from a collection of spooky anecdotes into a solvable, data-driven intelligence problem. It was a pragmatic, necessary pivot from a policy of information denial to a policy of information gathering. The institution had to admit it was blind before it could even begin the process of trying to see. And this admission, this fundamental rewiring of the institutional culture, represented the most profound shift of all. When you synthesize these powerful currents, the undeniable moral weight of eyewitness testimony, the stark and urgent national security implications, and the pragmatic need to dismantle a culture of stigma to gather data, you arrive at the power, true reason for the Pentagon's change of heart. It was an institutional reckoning. The UAP reality had become too big to ignore, too persistent to debunk, and too strategically dangerous to leave unaddressed. The updated report was not a confession, nor was it a full disclosure. It was something far more significant. It was the documentation of a paradigm shift. It was the moment a vast, conservative, and historically secretive institution formally acknowledged that it was grappling with a phenomenon that it could not explain, a phenomenon whose objects displayed capabilities beyond our known technological grasp. This is a monumental pivot. For the first time since the closing of Project Blue Book in 1969, the official position of the United States government shifted from one of categorical dismissal to one of cautious and deeply serious engagement. Think of it as a Copernican moment within the walls of the defense establishment. For its entire history, its worldview has been terrestrial. Its conflicts, its technologies, its adversaries were all earthbound. The UAP phenomenon presents a challenge that breaks this framework. It introduces a variable that is not accounted for in traditional war games or strategic doctrines. To deal with it, the institution itself has had to change. It has had to create new offices, new reporting structures, and a new vocabulary for discussing the unexplainable. It has been forced to confront the humbling possibility that our understanding of the world and our place within it might be incomplete. The report, with its dry, bureaucratic language, is easy to underestimate, but read between the lines and you see the blueprint for a profound intellectual and operational reorientation. It is the Pentagon's official, if reluctant, first step into a larger, stranger reality. It is an admission that the map we have been using no longer accurately represents the territory. This was not a decision made lightly. It was born of necessity, forged in the crucible of undeniable evidence and unacceptable risk. It represents the end of an era of convenient ambiguity and the beginning of a new era of uncomfortable questions. The government did not choose to enter this new territory willingly. It was pushed by its pilots, pushed by its admirals, pushed by the silent, indifferent physics of the objects themselves, and pushed perhaps by the arrival of cosmic curiosities like 3I, Atlas, that served as a stark reminder of just how much we still have to learn. The gears of government have now officially engaged with the mystery. The doors of perception, locked and bolted for more than half a century, have been officially pried open. But what the institution would find on the other side, and what it would ultimately mean for the rest of us, was a question that now hung silently and profoundly over everything, and so the ink dries on the latest addendum. The final page is turned on a document written in the dry, deliberate language of bureaucracy, a report that seems engineered to quell speculation rather than ignite it. Yet beneath the clipped acronyms and redacted paragraphs, we can feel the ground shifting. We can sense the tectonic plates of our collective worldview beginning to groan under a new and irresistible pressure. The journey we've taken together, from the lonely watch of a carrier strike group in the Pacific to the hushed, reverberant halls of Congress, has not been a simple ghost story. It has been a chronicle of a profound transition, a slow, arduous crawl from the shadows of ridicule into the stark, uncomfortable light of official inquiry. This report, this seemingly unassuming update from the Pentagon, is not the destination. It is perhaps for the first time in our history the officially sanctioned departure point. For generations, the question was relegated to the fringe, a topic for late-night radio shows and whispered conversations dismissed by the very institutions now tasked with its formal investigation. The experiences of decorated naval aviators, the anomalous data from billion-dollar sensor systems, the photographic evidence that defied easy explanation, all were points of light in a vast darkness of institutional denial. Each one was a solitary flare quickly extinguished by skepticism or classified silence. But now too many flares have been fired. Their combined light has illuminated the unmistakable outline of a phenomenon that refuses to be ignored, a presence in our skies that is both persistent and profoundly enigmatic. This document, therefore, is far more than a catalogue of unresolved cases. It is a quiet revolution codified on government letterhead. It is the United States government, the most powerful military and intelligence apparatus on Earth, formally admitting to the world and to itself that there are objects in its sovereign airspace, demonstrating technologies it cannot replicate and whose intent it cannot discern. This is not an end to the mystery. It is the end of the taboo. It marks the official, albeit reluctant, beginning of a new era of human exploration, an era where the frontier is not some distant star, but the very nature of the reality that surrounds us. The central finding of the report is not what it contains, but the void it conspicuously fails to fill. For all its analysis, for all its access to the planet's most sophisticated surveillance tools, the conclusion is a deafening silence on the question of ultimate origin. And in that silence, every possibility, no matter how unsettling, is allowed to breathe. The question is no longer times, if times these phenomena are real, but times, what times they are, a shift in inquiry so fundamental that its consequences will ripple through the coming decades, touching every aspect of our civilization. It compels us to confront the limits of our own understanding, to admit that our meticulously constructed models of physics, of propulsion, of what is and is not possible, may be tragically incomplete. We have spent centuries building a cathedral of science, a magnificent structure of equations and laws that explain the cosmos with breathtaking elegance. But these phenomena are like a strange music resonating from outside the cathedral walls, a melody that our physics says should not exist, yet our senses, both human and electronic, insist that it does. We find ourselves at a great fork in the road of understanding, facing two possibilities, each one more paradigm-shattering than the last. The first path is that these UAPs represent some form of exotic, undiscovered natural phenomena. This is often presented as the conservative, more palatable explanation, a way to resolve the mystery without invoking the spectre of the other. But let us not mistake this for a simple answer. To accept this path is to accept that our planet, our own atmosphere, can spontaneously generate entities that behave like intelligently controlled machines. It would mean that there are forms of energy or states of matter or even complex life forms made of plasma or coherent fields that have remained entirely unknown to a science that can map the cosmic microwave background and detect the collision of black holes a billion light-years away. It would demand a complete rewrite of meteorology, of physics, of biology. It would suggest that the world you inhabit is layered with a form of reality so alien that it has operated alongside us unseen and uncomprehended for all of human history. The implications are staggering. What other fundamental forces of the universe are we blind to? What other complex systems operate just beyond the narrow sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum we call sight? This path doesn't close the book on the mystery. It reveals that the library of existence is infinitely larger than we ever dared to imagine. It means the high strangeness is not from out there, but from right here, an intrinsic part of our world we have failed to recognize. Then there is the second path, the one that has been the object of both our deepest fears and our most profound hopes. It is the path that leads to the conclusion that at least some of these phenomena are manifestations of a non-human intelligence, technologically advanced and operating with a purpose we cannot yet fathom. For decades, this idea was the third rail of scientific and political discourse, untouchable, career-ending. But the data meticulously gathered by AARO and its predecessors, data showing extreme accelerations, hypersonic velocities, without thermal signatures, and instantaneous changes in direction, pushes us ever closer to considering it. The updated report, by failing to rule it out by admitting that a small but significant number of UAPs demonstrate unusual flight characteristics or performance capabilities, leaves that door ajar. And if we dare to step through it, even hypothetically, the world is forever changed. It would mean that we are not alone in the universe, a concept we have long entertained in the abstract. More critically, it would mean that times they are already here, asterisk. It reframes our entire existence. Human history ceases to be the sole central narrative of intelligence on this planet. Our triumphs in science, our art, our philosophies, our conflicts, all of it would be recalibrated as the endeavors of one species among at least two sharing the same physical space. The confirmation of non-human intelligence would trigger a societal shockwave of unprecedented scale, a cognitive earthquake from which no aspect of our culture would be immune. Our religions, many of which place humanity at the center of a divine plan, would be forced into a period of radical reinterpretation. How does the story of creation accommodate a neighbor who may be millions of years our senior? Our systems of governance and our concepts of national security, predicated on terrestrial rivalries, would become almost tragically parochial. Overnight, the great power competitions that dominate our headlines would suddenly seem like arguments over seating arrangements in a house that is not exclusively ours. What does sovereignty mean if it can be violated at will by technology that treats our most advanced fighter jets as irrelevant gnats? The psychological impact on us as a species would be impossible to overstate. It could be a catalyst for unparalleled unity, forcing us to see past our petty divisions and recognize our shared identity as humanity. Or it could spark new waves of fear, paranoia, and existential dread, a fracturing of society as we grapple with the realization that we may not be the apex predators, that we are living in a world whose rules we do not fully understand. The truth, when it comes, will not be a neat, tidy factoid. It will be a mirror, and what we see in it will reveal more about ourselves, our capacity for wonder, our tendency toward fear, our ability to adapt, than it does about any visitor, be they from across the galaxy or from a dimension folded within our own. This new era, sanctioned by the Pentagon's grudging admission, also heralds a renaissance for science itself. For 70 years, the study of these phenomena was starved of oxygen, denied funding, and ridiculed in academia. Mainstream science has been focused on the search for life out there, pointing our radio telescopes to the silent, distant stars, listening for faint whispers from across the void. That noble quest, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, has always operated under the assumption that the first contact would be a distant, controllable event, a deciphered signal, and intellectual exercise. But the UAP reality suggests a far more immediate and complex challenge. It suggests the laboratory is not in deep space but right here. It calls for a new multidisciplinary approach, a contact science that merges the skills of physicists, materials scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, and philosophers. The goal would no longer be just listening for a message, but trying to understand a presence. What new physics could be derived from analyzing the flight dynamics of a craft that appears to negate inertia? What new sources of energy could be imagined from an object that travels at Mach 10 with no visible means of propulsion? The ultimate prize is not just answering the question, are we, alone? It is the potential for revolutionary breakthroughs in our understanding of the universe itself. These objects, whatever their origin, are a living, dynamic puzzle box. The Pentagon report has just given the world's brightest minds official permission to try and pick the lock. We are moving from a paradigm of searching to a paradigm of observing, from a passive hope to an active investigation of a mystery that has come to us. And so we stand at the precipice of a profound reckoning. The journey that began with flickering lights seen by a bewildered pilot over the Cascade Mountains in 1947 has led us circuitously and contentiously to this moment of global contemplation. The updated UAP report is a milestone, not because of the secrets it reveals, but because of the questions it legitimizes. It forces us to look up at the sky, not with the casual familiarity of a species that believes it has mapped every corner of its world, but with a renewed sense of awe and humility. It asks us to consider that we may be like island dwellers who have spent millennia studying the intricacies of our own shoreline, charting every cove and every grain of sand, all while being completely unaware of the vast deep ocean that surrounds us and the unknown continents that may lie beyond the horizon. For too long we have operated with a comforting but fragile certainty about our place in the cosmos. We told ourselves a story of solitude, of being the sole bearers of consciousness in a silent universe. That story is now being challenged not by a philosophical treatise or a distant signal, but by recurring tangible events in our own skies, documented by our most credible observers and our most advanced technology. The comet 3I, Atlas, whose sudden, unexpected disintegration mirrored the shattering of our old assumptions, serves as a potent metaphor for our current condition. Our tidy, predictable model of reality is fracturing, breaking apart into 1,000 new points of light, each one a question, each one a mystery. We are a species defined by our curiosity, by our insatiable need to push past the horizon and know what lies beyond. It is the same impulse that drove our ancestors out of Africa, that pushed navigators across uncharted oceans, and that lifted astronauts toward the moon. Now that impulse is directed toward a frontier that may be the last and greatest of them all, the frontier of the unknown itself. We are being confronted with a phenomenon that is a reflection of our own limitations. Its existence tells us in no uncertain terms that we do not have all the answers. It reminds us that for all our accumulated knowledge, we remain infants in the timescale of the cosmos. The future of our species may well be defined by how we choose to engage with this enigma. Do we retreat into fear and denial, clinging to the comfortable certainties of the past? Or do we embrace the mystery with courage and an open mind, recognizing it as an unprecedented opportunity to learn, to grow, and to finally understand our true context in the universe? The updated Pentagon report provides no easy answers, nor should we expect it to. Its true value is as a summons. It is a call to awaken from our terrestrial slumber, to lift our gaze, and to begin in earnest the most profound conversation in human history. The conversation is not just about what is in our skies, it is about who we are, what we are capable of becoming, and what our ultimate purpose might be in a universe far stranger, more crowded, and more magnificent than we ever dared to believe.